Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our next panel. It's my pleasure to, as I mentioned earlier, I'm Brian Donahue, the Deputy Director for Next Century Cities, and I'm here to introduce our next moderator, Paulo, who is the Senior Programs and Data Manager for National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Paulo joined NDIA in summer of 2020. Prior to that, he began his career in public library education and outreach in 2013, first in Cleveland and then later in the New York Public Library. Paulo has worked with Mozilla Foundation with a cohort of practitioners advocates to develop the Web Literacy Toolkit, and has also served as an expert panelist for the American Library Association's conference to discuss digital literacy. He received his master's in library and information science with an emphasis on data and visualization and user experience from Pratt Institute. And I'll pass it over to him so he can introduce the panel and the panelists.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having us on here. I'm joined with two panelists, Peggy Schaefer and Ryan Collins, who I will invite to introduce themselves in just a moment. I believe we're waiting on one more person, but I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us for this panel presentation titled Reaching the People We Serve. As a part of the Next Century Cities all-day forum, we intend for this panel to address workarounds, issues, methods around how organizations, whether statewide, regional, and city, locally, are reaching residents who are historically unconnected for a variety of reasons. We'll be talking about what methods work best for reaching folks who are unconnected. We'll also be talking about specific barriers to adoption, whether that's infrastructure-based or otherwise. And then we'll be talking about what specific partnerships have worked for folks on this panel. So I'll introduce myself and then invite my panelists to introduce themselves. My name is Paula Balboa. Brian gave an excellent intro, just a little bit about who NDIA is. For some context, we are a unified voice for home and public broadband access, also for appropriate personal devices and local technology training and support programs. We work collaboratively with our network of over 600 affiliates across 44 states and territories to craft, identify, and disseminate financial and operational resources for digital inclusion programs, while also serving as a bridge for policymakers and the general public. So I'll introduce first Peggy Schaefer, who is the Executive Director of Connect Maine. We also have Ryan Collins, the Broadband Manager with the Buckeye Hills Regional Council. We are also joined by, Catherine Greiner, who is the City Administrator at Condon, Oregon. So I'll send it over to my panelists. We'll start with you, Peggy. Could you describe a little bit about your organization, a little bit about your role, and the specific community that you serve?
So, my name is Peggy Schaefer. I'm the Executive Director of the Connect Maine Authority. Connect Maine is the state broadband authority. So we are responsible, I think our statutory requirements or statutory goals are to bring broadband to everyone in the state and make sure they know how to use it. It's kind of a big goal, right? We have about 80,000 people in the state of Maine who have don't have a quality connection. So their connection is probably under 25.3. It's very difficult to participate in life these days, right? And so our goal is to try to figure out strategies to bring broadband to all those unconnected people, as well as trying to make sure that people across Maine have the ability to access and know how to use the internet and all the riches that it can bring. So we've been around since about 2007. We've done about 15 rounds of grants. We are right smack in the middle of an infrastructure grant right now. On our other program that we do is we do a community planning grant, and we have about 300 communities across the state that have been part of our community planning process.
That's super, Peggy. So, thanks for sharing, and we'll dig into some of those strategies and methods here in a little bit. So Peggy is representing the sort of the statewide perspective on reaching communities that are unconnected. Next, I want to invite Ryan Collins to introduce himself, who is representing sort of the regional view of connecting with folks. So Ryan, could you tell us a little bit about your organization, your role, and the communities that you serve?
Sure can, Paolo. Thanks. My name is Ryan Collins, Broadband Coordinator from Buckeye Hills Regional Council. We're a regional council of governments in southeastern Ohio, right in the heart of Appalachia. We cover 8 counties in southeastern Ohio, and we do a myriad of things when it comes to broadband, whether it be outreach, advocacy. We do a little bit of data collection. We spearheaded the efforts to create maps for the Appalachian counties in the state of Ohio and through speed testing. And those speed test maps then influenced our state to adopt the same methodology, and they developed their own maps for their broadband expansion program. And now we're getting a bunch of people connected in southeastern Ohio through the Ohio Broadband Expansion Grant. And now we're taking a step into digital inclusion and digital literacy. We are a part of NDIA. We are one of those affiliate organizations, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Ryan. We're happy for you to join us. And finally, Catherine, representing the city, the local perspective. A little bit about your organization and the role you play there, Catherine.
Good morning. Good morning here in Condon, Oregon. I have been the city administrator of the city of Condon, which is approximately 700 people in residence since 2004. We started working on some broadband projects in 2015 because at that point we realized that we did not have a fiber line that was accessible to our residents in Condon at that point. Since then, we have formed a fiber council, which we're working with Gillum County. And so to get how rural we are out here, we have a county of about 1,900. The city, of course, is 700. And I actually live in South Gillum County in a small area called Mayville. So what we're trying to figure out through all of this is to how to get broadband to our residents. And in the process over the last 6.5 years, we have gotten a fiber line into Condon. We also had another long haul provider go through Condon at the same time. So as we continue to work on trying to get it to our residents, that is the task that we've undertaken as a small town. I don't know if anyone has any other questions, but that's where we're at now.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks for highlighting those topics because I'm really excited to dig in to those. So some of those topics that you mentioned in your introduction throughout the course of our panel today, specifically about barriers to adoption, which we're going to get into here in just a bit. But first, I want to cue you all up, and before we talk about the barriers to adoption, barriers to outreach, I want to give you all a chance to describe how your organizations, how your departments, how do you reach residents with information and services, especially in a time, as COVID has highlighted over the past 2 years, when everyone needs to have some sort of connection. So let's start with talking about the victories. What works? What have you been doing in the past 2 years? And how are you connecting with folks where they are? Peggy, could we start with you?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, one of the big things that we do in Maine, and we've been doing it since about 2015, is what we call community planning grants. These, we strongly believe that for a community to get connected, it really has to start in that community. It really has to start with conversations in that community about what that community needs, what it looks like, what the service is like, understanding what the population is like. So who's going to have problems? Where are they going to have problems with access, not only because of lack of service, but because of affordability, and how to integrate the whole piece, not only the wire that runs by your house, but the ability to afford that wire, the ability to have a device that works, and the ability to understand how to use the internet. And so a big piece of our community planning process is not just figuring out how to get connected. It's these conversations that communities have that usually almost always end up with the commitment to universal service. And that commitment to universal service then follows with a strategy around affordability, around digital inclusion, and around digital literacy. So I said we have about 300 communities that have engaged in that. In some respects, Maine we did planning because we didn't have any money, right? So we didn't have any money for infrastructure, so we did planning instead. And now that the money is coming, now that there's federal money coming and we've had a little state money, we have the foundation in place to really build these projects up. And so, the process that we use has been very successful, and it's getting more and more success as we get more money. But again, it starts with those community voices and really a good understanding of what's going on in that community and how that community wants to fix those issues.
That's awesome. Peggy, I just want to follow up a little bit on that answer. So, the extensive community planning process behind getting this work going. I just had a follow-up question. What role, if any, does digital inclusion play into how you all are, assessing these conversations?
So a requirement of a community planning grant is that it have to include their report back to us, has to include a strategy around digital inclusion. So they have to look at how they're going to address the digital inclusion pieces in their community. And sometimes that's working with a nonprofit. We have a great one here in the state of Maine called the National Digital Equity Center, which has classes all across the state. They work in local libraries, they work with adult ed, and most of them now, since the pandemic, are all on Zoom. So they have a combination of in-person classes that's also Zoom, so people can all sign up. And those classes range from, how to be safe on the internet to advanced courses in Excel, which I should take. So those are all part of our community planning process. Part of our strategy for this federal money is going to be a deeper look into that and a deeper beef up of that community, that digital inclusion pieces, right? So part of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act is a digital inclusion plan. And so we're going to really ramp up our efforts around that as a result of that. But they have been at the core of what we've been doing for about 5 years now.
Thank you. And yeah, I love the shout out to the Maine Digital Equity Center. Susan Corbett over there is doing amazing work. Ryan, I wanted to send it over to you. How is the Buckeye Hills Regional Council, reaching residents with information and services, especially in COVID?
So there's a few different ways that we're doing that. One way that we reach the residents is by coordinating with their communities. We make sure to get the necessary information into the hands of our local commissioners, who then disseminate it down to the townships, who then disseminate it down to their residents. That's a big thing in rural areas, is coordination. We're all spread so far apart, so it's not like I can just go down the street and talk to Joe down at the commissioner's office and talk to them about what's going on and get the information into their hands. We also work with local organizations like the libraries, and we've also had success working with local utility companies to put information into our residents' bills. Because the fact is, in Appalachian, Ohio, a lot of our residents don't even have access to like 10.1 internet, let alone 25.3 or even 120. We have such low access that it's not even funny. Thankfully, because of that, we saw a lot of action in the state's broadband expansion grants, because they were looking to bring access to those that didn't have access first, and then moving on to those that don't have adequate access but have some form of access. So we're getting a lot of fiber builds in our area, which we will partially take credit for because we were able to coordinate with our local organizations, also with the ISPs. We were able to connect ISPs with our local government leaders because ISPs were the only eligible applicants for the program. But because we were able to coordinate that, they were better able to work with our community leaders, find out where the need was, and also collaborate together on applications. So we had good public-private partnerships across the board. I think that coordination is invaluable when it comes to not only access, but also digital inclusion. We just started stepping into the digital inclusion space. We were very, very focused on access previously, just because a majority of our residents don't have access. But now with the Ohio Expansion Grant dollars and also the IJA money coming down from BEAD soon, we feel that the natural next step is stepping into digital inclusion. So we've formed a broadband coalition, broadband committee at Buckeye Hills, which has representatives from a few local library systems. It has representatives from workforce development, has representatives from local government, which represents our executive board as well, because our executive board is made up of our local leaders, and goes down the gambit of anybody and everybody that should be included on the digital equity side of things. They have a voice on the committee. And so we just to recap, we reach our residents through collaboration because we're such a large area. If we tried to do it by ourselves, it would never work. And so through partnership and through collaboration, we're able to reach all of our residents as best we can.
Yeah, definitely. And from the digital inclusion perspective, can only say plus 1 million to the importance of partnerships in this sort of work, to make sure that we're not duplicating existing work, but also so that we make sure that we're spreading the efforts equally.
And not only that,
Catherine,
everybody has a different expertise. And so you need to bring those in and make sure that, like, oh, yeah, we're not necessarily good at the education piece, but the libraries have been doing this for decades. We should get them involved so that we can funnel people to them and properly advertise them.
Very well put. Yeah, knowing what your expertise is, and knowing where your organization ends, and another one may pick up. That's super. So yeah, from Ryan's perspective, I was hearing the effort of coordination across different partners, especially working in rural areas. Catherine, you mentioned that Condon also is a rural area. I'm curious to see or to listen to what your perspective is on this topic. How is your organization reaching residents?
So we have found we still have not reached all of our residents with the broadband that we were able to bring into Condon. And part of our issue is that we have an incumbent provider that has fought tooth and nail for us to bring in any sort of different way for people to get broadband. So the other thing that we did do is, the biggest part of this is education, to educate the residents on how to connect. And as we said, it's a really hard thing because we still don't have a lot of ways to connect them. But we did bring in, when we were just trying to figure out that people needed what they could use for high-speed broadband, because all we had was DSL, and in the rural areas, all we had was dial-up for a long time. And then we had a small provider, a wireless provider. And then a lot of people were having to go to satellite internet, which was HughesNet or Wild Blue, which was extremely expensive. And it's got data caps with all of it. So I guess the main part is just we had to try and educate them to get how to get connected. And the library, we actually took a high-speed internet connection before the town was wired with fiber to the home. We put one in there just so people could see what the possibilities were once they do that. Since we did that, I mean, almost everybody needs high speed due to their smartphones, their smart TVs, any type of work, and especially with COVID, put us all in a position where it was a necessity to have broadband, even at home, not necessarily at your work. And so we're still working on that. The one thing that came out of us trying to get broadband to residents was the incumbent did, at that point, do fiber to the home. They had no intention of doing it because they didn't think there was a need at that point. So that was one of the things we do. The issue we still struggle with getting it to the residents is affordability and access. And I should say that when me living out in rural, Condon does have good speeds. We still have some issues with our incumbent that I think some of the equipment, we have some inconsistencies in service. And I think that just comes from having one ISP and not multiple. And where I live, I have finally have switched to Starlink. And so far it's been good, but I did just last week already, after having Starlink for 6 months, get a notice that they're already raising the price on Starlink. So yeah, so it went from $99 a month now up to $110 a month.
If I gasped, I'm on mute, but I gasped audibly on my end. Gosh. So before we move on, so you raised a lot of interesting topics there, Catherine, which I want to touch on in our next topic, which is going to be the barriers to adoption. But before we move on to that topic, I want to ask, there's a shout out for anchor institutions like public libraries in the chat. I was just wondering, Catherine, from your perspective, what role does the public library play regarding connectivity? For instance, like, do they have fiber for their building?
They do have fiber, and we got the fiber line to them. But since then, it's a long story, and I won't go into it. But they now have another fiber connection through the city of Condon, through our fiber line. They now have it. They are an excellent part. They have always had free Wi-Fi. They have always had public computers. They haven't had any classes at this point, but our library is very, very small and can't handle a lot of class space. But without our library getting the word out, that has been one of the biggest champions of getting broadband to Condon has been the public library, and it's the Gillum County Public Library. I do need another shout out to another very good person that got a lot of information out is we have a weekly newspaper. And until 2 years ago, we had an editor that was born and raised here and was at every single meeting. And he also got a lot of information out about our connectivity when we were trying to get connected to a fiber line.
I'm hearing partnerships again. Importance of partnerships across your areas. And Peggy's just dropped in a link in the chat as well. So let's move on to this topic of barriers, the barriers to adoption, the barriers to getting home internet. We have a lot of rural representation among the panelists here, and certainly one of those barriers can simply be a lack of physical infrastructure, right? There's simply no access for some homes to get on high-speed internet. I want to talk about some of those barriers to adoption, though, as well. For households that do have that access but are not adopting, there's a number of reasons, and a few of them Catherine has touched on, for those barriers to adoption. Just to throw a few out there, cost, right? Maybe it's simply too expensive to get that home internet. Maybe there's this reliance on a community anchor institution like a library, but also there's these other topics that are a little bit more harder to define, which I'm sure each of you are seeing with your residents. For instance, confidence in using the internet, a lack of understanding of like the value of the internet, these harder to pin down ideas. So Peggy, I want to start with you. What are you doing to sort of address these gaps in adoption with folks across Maine? What's working and what's not working?
I think COVID worked great. Worked really great for people to understand their connection and why they needed it. And one of the things we discovered pretty early on in that when the schools shut down was the number of kids who didn't have access. And some of that was actually, there was no wire running by their house. Some of it was most of it was cost. And one of the things that we did, and things you do in March of 2020 are probably things you wouldn't do now with hindsight. But we used some of our COVID relief money to buy hotspots and tablets with hotspots. And, schools were passing them out. I think one principal told me like candy, because that was the only way kids could get connected. Right. So we, despite the fact that our big cable company had a low cost strategy for students, which dropped the cost to about $15 a month. There's some significant barriers to that. You can't have any previous debt. And so a family who had, service and didn't pay bills was now not eligible for that service. You had to be a new customer. So there's a number of things that became barriers in the existing affordability programs. And that's one of the reasons I think Congress created the emergency broadband benefit, right? Is because there were so many of those little glitches that families and homes were getting caught up on. I will say telemedicine in Maine hadn't been very popular, even though we're a very rural, very spread out state. People like to see their doctor. They like to drive that distance and go see their doctor. The pandemic changed a lot of that, and that increased the demand for telehealth services. And so we provided funding to the National Digital Equity Center through our Community Development Block Grant program to assist mostly seniors with a device. And to get that device, you had to take 5 classes. One of them was how to be safe on the internet, so some really basic stuff. And the devices were, they were iPads, but they're very simple iPads, right? So they're very easy to use. And that made a significant difference, not only for the ability to connect to your doctor, but for the ability to connect to your family, right? I mean, what's one of the things that happened with COVID is we became very isolated, and Zoom became sort of this normal, kind of like milk, right? And so that's some of the activities that we've tried to do. We've expanded that a little bit. We added a little funding in there so that people could get actual laptops from our PCs for People, which is Give Tech, Get Tech. And so that helps people who are looking for jobs or needed a laptop to get that kind of equipment that they needed. It is an ongoing battle, right? It is an ongoing battle. The thing about the devices and the hotspots that we did in March 2020 is that those subscriptions ran out about a year later. And so, that kind of effort was successful, but it was short term. The other thing that we've done, our network has beefed up the connections for all the schools and libraries in the state. They now all have access to a gig, and that has made a huge difference. It's not great to go hang out in your local library parking lot to do your homework, but it is there, and I've done it, and it's a tool that people can use if they have a device. They can go and hang out in the library. Our libraries also have changed what they do, right? They used to lend books. Now they really are computer centers. So there's been a number of things that have happened that are successful. It's really an ongoing effort because, the COVID virus has demonstrated the need for it, and it opened up a significant gap how we try to fill that need.
That's very well said. Thank you, Peggy. And again, I will always fully support any shout out to public libraries. So yeah, their roles have changed. And it's up to folks like us to let people know that the public library isn't just books anymore, right? There's so much more that they are. Ryan, I want to move on to you from your perspective, right? The Regional Hills, Buckeye Hills Regional organization. What are the types of barriers that you are seeing there in Appalachia? And is there an element? Is there a lack of trust with the folks that you're working with down there too? What are you doing about that?
Yeah, so lack of trust is one part of a big barrier in our region, and that's across Appalachia in general. Appalachians have been burned a lot of times by these like federal programs and state programs that have sought to bring resources into the area, and then those that get the money end up abusing it or not even spending it on what they're supposed to. Or it was a program that was designed for a certain part of the country, and our residents and our local organizations weren't really consulted on if it would work in Appalachia or not. They just saw that, like, oh, it was a pilot program that worked in another region, that worked in a different rural area, which is great, and I'm glad that it worked in that area, but it might not work in our region just for a myriad of reasons. Our culture is different, our people are different, and our history is different. So we've dealt with a lot of other things that other areas haven't, and other areas have dealt with things we've never had to deal with. And so lack of trust due to those things. And so that's just, we're trying to handle that through community outreach and education and really speaking with our people, because we're also from Appalachia. I grew up in southeastern Ohio and in Appalachia, and Appalachia runs through my veins, and making sure that they hear from people that live across the street from them and live down the road from them, that it's okay and that it's okay to trust this. And we have helped design these programs so that it'll work for you. To go to the libraries have been great. But unfortunately, due to lack of infrastructure, we have some counties that only have one library. And so people that live on the far edges of the counties away from those libraries don't have a library near them. So they didn't have a place where they could go and access it. in the parking lot. And heck, they probably don't even have a McDonald's that they can drive down to access Wi-Fi in that parking lot. And so we came out with a map of local Wi-Fi spots throughout the region that people could go and access and try to find those, whether it be a restaurant that has it or an anchor institution like a library. We worked with schools to get them to pump Wi-Fi out into the parking lots, and so students were able to come and sit in the parking lot. But even then, there were some schools that didn't have the resources to do that. We have in Crooksville, Ohio, they don't have any access. Barely, even if you drive through there, your cell phone will lose signal very quickly. And so they were having to have students come back and do the most old school of remote learning. They got a packet assignment at the beginning of the week. They come back the next Monday, drop off that packet, and pick up a new physical packet. They did not have access to their teachers during the week. They could not ask questions just because they didn't have connection. And so education has been a big barrier, not education in the way that like lack of access to school, but just lack of knowing where they can find these resources, lack of knowing where they can find devices that get connected. The topography has been huge. That's been a huge issue just with infrastructure in general. The Appalachian Mountains are the oldest mountains in the world. And so digging and putting fiber underground here is almost nearly impossible because of the high costs. And the population density has made us into some of the highest cost areas to expand broadband in the country and in the world. Appalachian Ohio also sees some of the highest poverty rates across the entire country. And so just lack of affordable access is a very big issue as well. It's why we push the ACP so hard here in the area. And we've advocated for to be eligible for IJA, you need to have a low cost option that can be covered by the ACP, but still be adequate internet. It upsets me greatly when I see that people are like, oh, here's our low cost option, but it's 5 megs download speed and like 1 meg upload speed. That's not broadband. That shouldn't count. Why are you able to offer that as a low cost option? Nobody's going to be able to use that if they have more than one person in the house and they're trying to run more than one program. And so that's just some barriers that we face. Appalachia runs the gambit of the barriers, but we work together and collaborate to hurdle over them.
Thanks for sharing that, Ryan, especially the issue around simple topography, right? That's like geographically, Appalachia is in more ways cut off like that or, separated from the rest of the country in more ways than one. So thank you for expanding upon that.
And then it also just makes some technologies not work, like Starlink with Catherine. Yeah. Even if they put 1,000 million satellites up in the air, it's probably still not going to be able to reach the hollers that we have. And that's if people can afford it here also, like all the hollers and hills. And it's just so we've had to be very open-minded with our solutions as well, because one solution for even an area a couple miles down the road might be different from where it is right here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's certainly, that comes with the perspective of serving an entire region as well. So Ryan mentioned education, not in the sense of school education or literacy education, but as far as like information sharing. Catherine, you had mentioned education in your remarks earlier. I'm curious from your perspective in Condon, how are you using this idea of education or information sharing to address the barriers there?
And to part of that too is one of the biggest parts when we started this, trying to get broadband to the residents, was the lack of understanding of our community leaders. And unfortunately, part of that still happens. So what we tried to do, let me give you an example too, is when we first started this process, our county judge, which is actually the head of the Board of Commissioners, is what they're called in this county, that and another person, they were convinced that they needed broadband, but it was only going to be used for schools and emergency services. So they didn't think that it was economic development, and they didn't think that the residents needed any high-speed broadband. Of course, this was before COVID too, when it became more apparent that everyone did need high-speed broadband. So our big thing is we did do a strategic plan, and part of it was education, and another part was just sitting down with them and and having the community leaders participate in the plan so they could understand what we were trying to do. I'm not saying it was all that successful because we still have a health district. We have a health district administrator right now that is not, she thinks what she has right now is fine. And so I think we're a little limited on some telemedicine. I mean, we can do telemedicine from the parking lot to the clinic inside, but to actually remote into hospitals or doctor specialists that are in Portland, which is about 170 miles away, we're still working on that barrier. So a part of that is hard. The other part that I have found as a challenge, as a barrier, is change is hard. And it's hard for people that have been stuck in their ways. We're an agricultural community. They're very stuck on what a lot of them grew up here, are still here. So any type of change of something new is always a challenge, even though broadband, a bunch of them use it for farming now and use it for any part of their agriculture that they need. So, and then back to Peggy's too, and to Ryan's, is affordability. A lot of the barrier is affordability. And of course, in our place, it's not just affordability, it's accessibility, that you can't get anything else when you live out in the county. And there's no other options. And so what we're trying to do is, one barrier that we discussed earlier is, one barrier that Condon has not had has been financial. We have a county that is very flush with money. And so when we started the broadband process, we did get some money for them. And also too, we had enough money in reserves that we were able to lease dark fiber to come into Condon. So that hasn't been the biggest part. And the county's actually doing a study right now to see about a wireless network, but it's kind of been put on hold because most of the people that work at the courthouse that are rural have all got Starlink. So one of the options that has been thrown out is that maybe the county should just buy Starlink for everyone. Well, that's fine, except for how do you pay the $110 a month after that for some of the people that are in rural? So I think that the other thing too is, two of the other barriers that we have obviously is our incumbent provider. They don't want to share any of the market, which the market's so small that it would be hard to share it. And the other part is USDA and all the federal grants, the federal money that's coming down the pipe. That's really, really hard for us to access. It takes a lot of technical time and staff to write one of the USDA grants. And the other thing too is the big census block that we meet the speeds in the city of Condon that the USDA has set out, which is 25 down and 3 up, I believe. But we don't get it in the county. And then we're so remote that what are you going to get? You're going to get maybe 20 farmhouses in one part of the county. So those are some of our barriers that it's still a challenge.
Thank you, Catherine. And yeah, I like that you mentioned that your county is flush with cash, right? The money is there, and I'll just transition that into talking about federal money coming down the pipeline, right? There's the Digital Equity Act. There's more programs from the Infrastructure Act. So the states are soon to be flooded with money for grants regarding digital equity and digital inclusion programs. So the interest will be there, and by me getting on my advocacy stool for a second, it's going to be up to people like us to educate policymakers and leaders to say why this matters, why what we can do with this sort of money. So I am just I think this panel could talk all day about this topic, but I see that we're up to time. I just want to thank each of my panelists, Peggy, Catherine, Ryan. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for sharing a little bit of your expertise with us today. Catherine, hello, Catherine. Catherine put a question in the chat about ensuring hotspots reporting speed tests periodically. Ryan has done work with speed test mapping in a program called Connecting Appalachia. Catherine, I will recommend that you reach out to Ryan, who put his contact info a little bit higher in the chat. hopefully get that conversation going. But for now, we'll sign off, the four of us here. Thank you all for joining our session about reaching people where they are. And for now, I'll just send it back to folks at Next Century Cities. That'd be Brian.
Yeah. Yep. Thank you so much for that awesome panel. We very, very much appreciate it. We're going to move to breakout rooms that are going to be guided by two of our partner organizations. That would be Claire from Open Technology Institute and Samantha from the Marconi Society. So thank you very much. And the prompts for the breakout rooms will be coming over shortly.